2 bear cubs were left to die in the snow until a broken trucker heard their cries. The storm roared across the Minnesota borderlands like a living beast, its breath a torrent of wind and snow that erased the world in white. Kalen Riker squinted through the windshield of his 18-wheeler as gusts pounded the cab, the wipers barely keeping up. The road was a straight, endless ribbon vanishing into oblivion, marked only by the reflective glimmer of his headlights bouncing off falling flakes. He was alone out here, no cars for miles, no radio signal, just the hum of his truck and the ghost that had long since taken up residence in his heart. The night reminded him of another storm, years back, when everything he had known was swallowed by grief, his wife's sudden passing, the silence that grew between him and his daughter, Emmy, the slow unraveling of a man who no longer knew where he was supposed to be. He hadn't celebrated a birthday since, hadn't unpacked the house he bought in Montana, just kept moving. That was easier, safer. His gloved hands tightened on the wheel, eyes flickering to the dashboard clock. Midnight. The storm had been unrelenting since sundown, snow climbing up along the highway's edges like the earth itself was giving up. It was then, in the periphery of his vision, that something moved, a flicker, small, sudden, just off the shoulder, half buried in snow. He hit the brakes. The truck groaned in protest as the tires screamed across the ice, sliding several feet before coming to a halt. His heart pounded as he leaned forward, trying to see through the swarming flurry outside. There it was again, a shape. No, 2 shapes, slumped, barely distinguishable from the snowdrifts around them. He grabbed his flashlight, tugged on his flannel jacket, and swung open the cab door. The wind slapped him with ferocity, stinging his cheeks and eyes. He trudged through knee-high snow, flashlight beam darting ahead like a desperate question. When the light finally caught on fur, his breath hitched, 2 bear cubs, grayish-brown fur crusted with blood and ice. They were young, too young to be without a mother. But it was the sight of the barbed wire wrapped around their small bodies that stopped him cold, thick loops of it, tight and cruel, digging into their sides and necks. The bigger cub lay half upright, shivering violently, a low whimper rattling in its throat. The smaller one was nearly still, eyes barely open, breath shallow. Kalen sank to his knees. God, what the hell happened to you? His hands fumbled for the knife clipped to his belt. The wind bit at his face as he worked, the blade trembling in his grip. He tried to be careful, but every movement was a race against the cold, against the blood soaking into the snow beneath him. One wrong move and he'd make the cuts worse. The wire snagged his gloves, sliced into his skin, but he didn't stop. "Hold on," he whispered. "Just hold on." When the last coil came loose, he shed his jacket and wrapped the cubs together inside it, holding them close against his chest. They were cold, frighteningly cold. He could feel their trembling through the fabric, feel their breath catching. "You're not dying out here. Not tonight." He stumbled back to the truck, slammed the cab door shut against the storm, and cranked the heater, laying them gently on the passenger seat. He looked down at them. The larger cub stirred, blinking up at him with dark, glassy eyes. There was a spark in them, a fire that hadn't gone out yet. "Ash," Kalen murmured. "Your ash. Still burning." His gaze fell to the smaller one, curled into Ash's side like a dying ember. "And your clover? For luck. Fragile, but still here." He rubbed warmth into their limbs as the truck rumbled forward, tires crunching slowly along the unplowed road. He drove blind into the storm, trusting instinct more than GPS. Somewhere ahead was Fernbrook, a town he'd pass through once a year en route to Canada, a blip of lights and back roads. But he remembered one thing: a small animal clinic open 24 hours. He prayed it was still there, and still open. The drive felt eternal. His eyes stung from the strain, his muscles ached from tension, but every time he glanced at the bundle beside him and saw Ash twitch or Clover sigh, he pressed harder on the gas. Just after 1 a.m., headlights lit up the wooden sign swinging in the wind: Fernbrook Animal Care. Dr. Lena Moretti. A beacon in the dark. He barely stopped the truck before leaping out, cradling the bundled cubs in his arms as he rushed to the entrance. The door opened before he could knock. A woman stood there, sturdy in flannel and jeans, her dark hair pulled back in a hasty braid. Her eyes widened when she saw what Kaylin held. "Are those, oh my God, are those bear cubs?" "Barbed wire. Found them off Route 11. They're barely hanging on." "Inside," she snapped, already pulling on gloves. The clinic was warm and clean, smelling faintly of antiseptic. He laid the cubs on a padded exam table, stepping back to give the woman room. She moved quickly, with the efficiency of someone who'd done this 100 times, though probably never with bears. "I'm Lena," she said over her shoulder. "Vet here." "Kaylin." "Well, Kaylin, you just complicated my night in the best possible way." She smiled briefly, but her focus was absolute. Kaylin hovered nearby, unable to sit, hands clenching and unclenching. He flinched when Clover let out a faint wheeze. "Will they make it?" "Ash might. He's stronger." "Clover," Lena shook her head. "We'll try everything." Together they worked into the early hours, cleaning wounds, administering fluids, applying salve to frostbitten paws. Ash responded quickly. He even lifted his head and growled faintly when Lena swabbed the wound. Clover, by contrast, was terrifyingly still, her breaths too soft, too slow. Lena wrapped her in heated towels, added another pad beneath her, and whispered encouragement as she worked. Kaylin, exhausted, didn't leave her side. At one point Lena offered him coffee. He took it with shaking hands. "You stayed with them," she said quietly, watching him. "Most people wouldn't. Couldn't. Leave them?" "Not after," he trailed off. His voice cracked. Lena didn't press. She just nodded and went back to work. By dawn, the snow had eased, the storm was weakening. Inside the clinic, the warmth was almost enough to make the world feel safe again. Ash was asleep, chest rising and falling steadily. Clover too had stabilized, not out of the woods, but no longer dying. Kaylin sat in a chair near their table, chin resting on his chest, eyes half closed. Lena approached with 2 steaming mugs. "They're alive," she said softly. "That's a start." "Thank you," he whispered. "You did the hard part," she replied. "You gave them a chance." Kaylin looked toward the cubs, his eyes lingering on their faces. They were wild animals, untamed, and yet he felt something shift in him, watching them sleep. Like maybe the road didn't have to be so long anymore. Like maybe he'd found something to stay for. Kaylin didn't sleep that first morning. Not really. He drifted between moments of quiet and the soft rustling sounds from the treatment room where Ash and Clover rested. Every creak of the building made him sit a little straighter, listening for trouble. Outside, the storm was retreating, leaving behind a silence almost too vast, too raw. The world looked like it had been scrubbed clean overnight, but inside him, something unfamiliar still churned. A flicker of warmth where there had only been cold for years. Lena moved through the clinic like someone used to filling silence, her voice always steady when she spoke, her movement sure. She let him stay, didn't question when he started helping, didn't bat an eye when, instead of getting back on the road, he rolled out a sleeping bag in the corner room with a broken radiator. "It's not much," she said, "but it's warm." He nodded. That was enough. He didn't want much, just to be nearby. Just to know they were breathing. The days blurred, held together by routine and the low hum of the space heater in the hallway. Kaylin fixed the front gate that had been hanging lopsided for weeks, repaired a sagging section of the barn fence, cleaned stalls even though they housed no animals yet, just the ghosts of others. He didn't talk much, but Lena didn't need him to. Sometimes she'd pass him a mug of coffee in the morning and nod toward the exam room. That was enough. The cubs were improving, slowly, especially Ash. The stronger one had begun to stand on shaky legs, his fur thickening out, the patches of skin healing. His eyes were sharp now, full of untamed spark. Clover was slower. She remained quieter, more tentative, but she responded to touch, nudged gently into sleep by Lena's steady hands or Kaylin's deep voice murmuring low stories he hadn't told anyone in years. "I used to read to Emmy like this," he said one evening, watching Clover blink drowsily at him. "Fairy tales mostly. She liked the ones where animals talked." Lena crouched nearby as she rubbed ointment into Clover's side and glanced up. "You've got a daughter?" He hesitated, then nodded. 15 now. "Haven't seen her in 3. The words hung there like frost on a window pane, brittle and delicate. Lena didn't press, just returned her attention to the cub, who shifted slightly in her sleep. "Kids come back around," she said softly. "Given time." Kaylin didn't answer. He didn't know if Emmy would want to come back around, even if he begged, and begging wasn't something he knew how to do anymore. Instead, he poured himself into the little lives before him. Ash would watch him now when he entered, sometimes rising with a low grunt to follow him across the room like a tiny gray shadow with teeth. Clover liked to rest against his boot when he sat. He didn't dare move when she did. One afternoon, just as Lena stepped out to make a supply run, Kaylin heard the bell above the clinic's door jingle faintly. He wasn't expecting anyone, and the town wasn't the kind of place where people wandered in unannounced. He stood from the bench in the corner and walked to the front. A woman stood there, maybe in her 30s, holding a phone out like a shield. "Are you the guy with the bear cubs?" she asked, eyes wide with curiosity. "I saw the video on TikTok." "Video," he repeated, heart sinking. She flipped her screen toward him. There they were, Ash curled beside Clover in the passenger seat of his truck, the image clearly filmed through the window. It was taken the night of the rescue. He didn't even know anyone had been out there. "It's got over 2 million views," she said. "People are calling it the Bear Man and the Blizzard." He rubbed a hand over his face, suddenly weary. "That's not. I didn't want this." She smiled, softer now. "A lot of people do. Want it, I mean. A story that reminds them there's still good out there." She left after a few more questions, and Kaylin stood in the doorway long after her car vanished down the snow-packed road. He didn't want attention. He wanted quiet, healing. But maybe it wasn't just about him anymore. The calls started the next day. Lena's front desk phone rang for the first time in weeks, journalists, wildlife experts, a woman from Vermont who'd knitted bear-sized sweaters just in case. Kaylin avoided the attention where he could, but not all of it could be ignored. And some of it brought something unexpected, a message left on the clinic's voicemail by someone named Suddy. Lena played it on speaker while they cleaned Clover's bandages. She said she knows Emmy, Lena murmured. Kalen froze. The name hit him like ice water. My Emmy. Lena played the message again. A teenage voice came through, shaky and unsure but unmistakably familiar. Hi. I think you might be my dad. Kalen's breath caught. The voice was different from the one he remembered, older, uncertain, laced with quiet hope. But it was hers. Emmy. After 3 years of silence, of unanswered letters and birthdays missed, there she was, reaching out. He didn't call back immediately. His hands shook for an hour before he picked up the phone. The line rang twice. Then, hello. A pause, then, hi. The word cracked between them like a bridge rebuilding itself, plank by plank. You saw the Cubs? He asked. Yeah, she hesitated. Ash is cute. Clover looks like she'd be soft. He let out a breath that shook his whole chest. She is. The conversation was short, careful. But when Emmy said, I'd like to see you, he said the only thing that mattered, me too. When she arrived a week later, Kalen was waiting outside the clinic in his patched flannel, fingers twitching against his side. Emmy stepped out of the car bundled in a green parka, her expression tight. She looked taller, older, but her eyes? They were still her mother's. For a long second, they just stared at each other. Then Ash barreled toward her, stopping inches away before sniffing her boots, tongue flicking out to nudge her ankle. Emmy knelt down, cautious. Clover padded closer, slower, her delicate frame brushing against Emmy's shin. Kalen watched, hardly breathing. Emmy looked up at him, tears glinting. They remember you, she whispered. They trust you. Kalen nodded, throat too tight for words. The moment didn't need them. The frost between them began to thaw, not in some sweeping cinematic instant, but in something quieter, a glance, a touch, a shared silence. That evening, Emmy sat beside him in the waiting room, feeding Clover small pieces of banana. Ash sprawled across both their feet like a self-appointed guardian. You're different, Emmy said. The last time. So are you. I'm glad you didn't leave them. Me too. She looked at him then, really looked. Maybe you won't leave me either. He turned toward her, eyes full. Not again. The storm had come and gone, but inside the little clinic in Fernbrook, something new had started to bloom, not just healing, not just survival, but a family slowly stitching itself back together in the warmth of second chances. Ash was the first to recognize the sound of gravel crunching beneath boots. His ears twitched, head lifting from his resting spot near the front window sill of the clinic. Kalen looked up from the old rocking chair Lena had placed beside the wood stove, his preferred spot now when night crept in and the weight of quiet filled the place like fog. Emmy had been gone 2 weeks. After their brief reunion, she'd returned to her mother's in Duluth with a promise to come back. They'd exchanged phone calls, short, sometimes awkward, but each one a little easier, a little more filled with laughter. The snow was melting now. Spring had begun to whisper across the fields outside Fernbrook, and the icicles hanging from the clinic's roof cracked with sunlight. But it was still cold enough at night for the stove to glow, and for Kalen to find comfort in the way Ash leaned against his legs like the cub needed the contact just as much as he did. The sound came again, boots moving steadily. Kalen stood, his joints stiff, and stepped out onto the porch. A man waited at the edge of the drive, hands in his coat pockets, scarf pulled high. He was lean, mid-40s maybe, with tired eyes and a badge clipped to his belt. You Kalen Riker? He asked, voice wind-cut. Kalen nodded. Wildlife Services? The man said, offering a small wave. "Name's Darren Lehen. I'm here about Ash and Clover." The words settled like frost over the porch. Kalen felt his gut twist. He'd known this moment would come. Lena had warned him gently, bear cubs were wild animals, and eventually someone higher up the ladder would take notice, especially with the story spreading the way it had. Still, part of him had hoped that by keeping quiet, by just staying put, he could outrun the inevitable. "They're stable now," Darren said, stepping forward, voice not unkind. "Word is they wouldn't be if not for you. But they can't stay here." "I know," Kalen murmured. Ash padded out behind him. Squinting at the stranger, sniffing the wind, Clover was still inside, curled against a heated pad in the exam room where she liked to nap in the afternoons. "We've got a facility," Darren continued. "Life rehabilitation. New. Funded by the same folks who saw the video of you and the cubs. Sanctuary-type setup, not a zoo. It's built for orphans like these two. Safe. Expansive. Secluded." Kalen stared at the man, something old and stubborn tightening in his chest. "They'll be alone. They'll be with their own kind," Darren replied gently. "Other cubs. Some rescued, some born there. It's not goodbye, Mr. Riker. It's a beginning." Kalen didn't answer right away. Ash had wandered to the edge of the porch, sniffing the air. He was bigger now, stronger. His wounds were nearly invisible beneath new fur. But he still looked over his shoulder at Kalen like a pup unsure of what came next. Lena appeared in the doorway, face drawn. She had known this too, had likely called Wildlife Services herself. Kalen met her eyes, and she nodded once. It was time. The next morning was quiet. Too quiet. Even the birds seemed to know something was shifting. Clover whimpered softly as Lena adjusted the crate's bedding, tucking in a soft blanket that Kalen had worn thin over the years, now repurposed as something familiar. Ash resisted going into his carrier at first, claws scraping the floor, muscles tense. But when Kalen knelt down and rested a hand on his head, whispering his name, the cub finally stepped inside. Emmy arrived just before they loaded the truck, her eyes rimmed red but smiling when she saw the cubs, kneeling to touch each through the open doors of their crates. "I made them a photo," she said, holding up a laminated sheet, an image of Kalen, her, and the two cubs sitting together beneath a spruce tree near the edge of the woods behind the clinic. "So they'll remember." Kalen swallowed hard. "They will." The drive to the sanctuary was 3 hours long and winding. Emmy sat in the back seat of Lena's SUV with the crates beside her, one hand resting on each. Kalen drove behind them in his truck, trailing like a shadow. The sanctuary sat nestled in the folds of a forested valley, surrounded by snow-dusted hills and thick pines. Tall fences stretched toward the sky, but inside there was space, acre upon acre of open terrain, rocky outcrops, streams, and tree groves designed to mimic the cubs' natural world. Darren met them at the gate, clipboard in hand. "We'll ease them in," he explained. "Half-acre pen first. Then once they acclimate, we open the gates. It's slow, but it works." Kalen helped unload the crates. Ash growled once when the gate opened, but Darren crouched nearby, tossing a piece of apple toward the grass. Ash hesitated, then padded out slowly, nose to the ground. Clover followed a few minutes later, blinking against the light. She stayed close to the fence at first, her eyes scanning the trees. But then Ash let out a soft sound, low and uncertain, but curious, and she turned toward it. They vanished into the underbrush together a few moments later. Emmy stood beside Kaylin, their shoulders nearly touching. "Will they come back if we visit?" she asked. Darren, standing a few paces away, answered without looking up. "They'll remember. Cubs imprint fast, especially when it's life or death. If they trust you now, they'll keep trusting you." Kaylin watched the trees sway in the breeze. "Can we visit? Observation lines open every weekend. Just don't call them. Let them come to you." Kaylin nodded. Emmy slid her hand into his. For the first time in years, he didn't flinch from the contact. They stayed for an hour. Ash appeared once at the tree-line, staring at them from beneath a tangle of brush. Clover emerged minutes later, ears twitching. She didn't come close, but she sat calm and quiet, her eyes on them. Kaylin whispered their names just once, not to call, just to remember. The drive back was silent. Lena had stayed behind to speak with May, the sanctuary staff. So Kaylin and Emmy rode together in his truck. She played music on her phone, soft, old folk songs that Kaylin didn't recognize but liked anyway. He didn't know how to fill the space yet, but for once, it didn't feel like he had to. "I'm proud of you," Emmy said softly as they passed the stretch of highway where he'd first seen the cubs. "You didn't run." He let out a breath that might have been a laugh. "Neither did you." When they reached Fernbrook, Emmy didn't rush to go. She helped unload supplies Lena had left in the bed of the truck, helped Kaylin refill the hay in the clinic's barn. As the sun dipped low, she paused in the doorway. "I don't have to go back tonight." Kaylin looked at her, a mix of surprise and quiet hope blooming in his chest. "You can stay as long as you want." That night, he built a fire in the stove, and Emmy fell asleep on the old clinic couch, wrapped in a quilt she'd pulled from the linen closet. Kaylin sat beside her for a while, watching the flames flicker in the cast-iron grate. On the table were 2 mugs of cocoa, half-drunk and growing cold. Outside, the wind was still. No blizzard. No frost. Just the soft hush of a world beginning to breathe again. Kaylin leaned back in his chair and let his eyes close, a flicker of peace settling across his chest. He had let go of Ash and Clover, but not lost them. He had found Emmy again. He was no longer driving toward emptiness. Not anymore. Spring settled slowly over Fernbrook, like a careful hand smoothing creases from a worn quilt. The snow retreated inch by inch, exposing patches of brown earth and the brittle promise of green beneath. The frozen silence that had ruled for months now gave way to birdsong and thaw-drip, the rhythms of life stirring again. Kaylin stood in the gravel lot beside the clinic, sleeves rolled past his elbows, leaning into the rake as he pulled dead leaves from the flower beds Lena insisted on reviving each year. Emmy was inside, helping with the baby goats brought in 2 nights ago, their mother too weak to nurse after giving birth. Lena said they'd make it. And Kaylin believed her now, the way he used to believe in the constancy of long roads and distant horizons. The old beliefs had shifted. What he stayed for had changed. He glanced at the small framed photo hanging just inside the clinic's entrance, Emmy laughing with her arms around Ash's thick neck, Clover standing close by with one paw resting on Kaylin's boot. It had been taken a month ago at the sanctuary, on their 3rd visit. And though he hadn't intended to keep returning, the pull was undeniable. Each time they stood behind the observation line, Kaylin wondered if it would be the last time the cubs came close. But Ash always did, emerging from the trees with that steady, curious gaze, watching Kaylin with something that felt like understanding. Clover was more cautious, as ever, but she'd begun creeping closer too, sniffing the air and tilting her head at the sound of Emmy's voice. It was never a guarantee. That was the thing about wildness, it didn't owe you anything. And still, they came. Emmy's footsteps crunched across the gravel now as she stepped outside, cheeks flushed, an old wool sweater hanging from her shoulders like a badge of belonging. "One of the goats tried to eat my braid," she said, grinning. Kalen chuckled, brushing soil from his hands. "Means he likes you?" "Or that he thinks I'm food," she countered. Then her face turned more thoughtful. "Can we go to the sanctuary this weekend?" Kalen's nod was immediate. "Yeah. We'll leave early. Might catch them before the sun gets too high." She smiled, and he caught the edge of something else there, not just joy, but peace. Something he hadn't seen in her for years. They packed early Saturday morning, stopping at a bakery for warm muffins and coffee before turning north toward the hills. The road curved through pine stands and river valleys still touched with frost, but the sky was blue, wide open and kind. They didn't talk much, Emmy with her feet on the dash, headphones in, Kalen with one hand resting near the heat vent and the other loose on the wheel. But silence no longer meant distance between them. It meant comfort. A shared understanding. Like a conversation carried in the spaces between words. The sanctuary had changed in small ways since their first visit. A new pen was under construction, larger, meant for yearlings that would eventually graduate to full release. A volunteer named Marn waved them through, recognizing them instantly. "They've been active today," she said. Ash especially chased a crow halfway across the clearing. Kalen smiled at that. He could picture it, the blur of gray fur and gleaming eyes. They walked quietly to the observation line, Emmy's hand trailing the fence slats. When they reached the viewing post, Kalen set down his thermos and leaned forward, scanning the distant trees. It took only a moment before movement stirred at the edge of the pines. Ash, bigger than ever now, thick with muscle and confidence, his coat glossy under the sun. He stepped into the open without hesitation, head raised. Kalen didn't move, he knew better. Ash's eyes flicked toward him, holding the gaze for several long heartbeats before he began a slow, winding path toward the fence line. Not a charge, not a sprint, just a steady approach. Clover emerged a minute later, blinking in the light. She hung back, then padded quietly after him. They stopped 10 feet away. Ash lowered his head slightly, sniffing the breeze. Clover sat beside him, ears twitching. Emmy crouched slowly, pulling out the laminated photo again. She didn't wave it, just rested it against her knees. "Hey, babies," she whispered. "Still remember us?" Ash gave a low chuffing sound, almost like a huff of breath through a laugh. Clover tilted her head, inching closer, and then, without warning, she nudged her nose gently against the bottom rail of the fence. Emmy's breath caught. Kalen remained still, barely breathing. The gesture was brief, subtle, but unmistakable recognition. Connection. When Clover turned and ambled back into the trees, Ash followed, pausing once to glance over his shoulder before disappearing into the shadows. Kalen leaned back, blinking hard. Emmy looked up at him, eyes shining. "They know us," she said. "Still." He nodded, the words caught somewhere in his chest, too big to speak. On the drive back, Kalen asked, "How's school feel these days?" Emmy shrugged. "Better. I think I want to switch to environmental science next year. Maybe animal behavior." Kalen's heartbeat quickened. "You'd be great at it." She glanced at him. "You really think so?" "Yeah. I see the way you are with them. You belong out there." She smiled quietly. "Maybe you do too." That night, back at the clinic, they sat on the porch as the sky faded into dusk. Lena joined them with 3 mugs of tea, and for a while, they just sat, listening to the wind tug at the eaves and the faint bleating of the goats in the barn. "I heard from the sanctuary staff today," Lena said, sipping from her cup. "They're starting a public education program. Might need volunteers for wildlife care over the summer." Kaylin raised a brow. "You suggesting we sign up?" Lena shrugged. "You've got a good way with creatures that don't trust easy. Seems like a waste to keep that locked away." Emmy grinned. "We should do it." Kaylin didn't answer right away, but a quiet, expanding warmth settled in his chest. The thought of staying didn't feel like a compromise anymore, it felt like a choice. Weeks passed, and spring leaned fully into summer. Grass pushed up through the thawed earth and wildflowers speckled the meadows beyond the town. Kaylin found himself taking deeper breaths, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. He fixed Lena's old tractor, built a new fence post for the donkey enclosure. Emmy spent hours in the clinic and evenings sending college applications. She never let him see them until she'd hit submit. One morning, a letter arrived addressed to the Bear Man of Fernbrook. It was from a child in Oregon, age 7, who had seen the video and now wanted to rescue bears one day too. Kaylin read the letter twice, then tucked it into the side of the photo frame in the clinic. Their final visit to the sanctuary that summer was quiet. Ash was taller now, broader. Clover stood a little straighter, less wary. They didn't approach the fence this time, but they watched from the trees, and that was enough. "They're learning to be what they were meant to be," Kaylin said, watching them. "And we're learning too," Emmy replied, "to let go without losing." On the drive home, Kaylin pulled off onto the shoulder where the rescue had happened months ago. The snow was long gone, but the memory remained, crisp and sharp as broken ice. He walked to the ditch where he'd first seen them, 2 trembling shapes caught in wire, on the edge of life. Emmy stood beside him. "You could have driven past," she said. "But I didn't," he answered, "because something in me, it just wouldn't let go." She nodded. "You saved them. And maybe yourself too." He smiled, small and quiet. "Maybe we all did." The sun dipped behind the horizon, painting the world in shades of amber and ash. Kaylin slid his hands into his pockets, standing still. No engine humming, no cargo to carry, no destination pressing. Just this place, this moment, this daughter beside him. The bears were where they belonged now, and so, at last, was he. Autumn rolled into Fernbrook not with a hard roar, but with a quiet hush, a soft breath of wind that turned the trees to fire and gold. The air smelled of wood smoke and ripe earth, and the sun, once high and sharp, began to linger lower in the sky, casting long honeyed shadows across the fields. Kaylin Riker had come to know the rhythm of this land now, the way the crows arrived early and loud in the morning, the way the goats bleated at precisely the same time each dusk for their feed, the way Lena hummed off-key when she was nervous, and the way Emmy left her shoes by the back door as if she had always lived there. The house behind the clinic had become more than a place to sleep, it was somehow home. He still rose early most days, more out of habit than necessity, pouring coffee before the sky brightened, checking the generator, walking the perimeter fence with a slow, steady gait. Emmy sometimes joined him, her breath visible in the cold as she zipped her coat higher and complained half-heartedly about the chill. "You love it," he'd say. "I tolerate it," she'd mutter, grinning. They had fallen into a rhythm that neither of them spoke about too much, neither eager to name it for fear it might dissolve, but it was there. A quiet understanding. A beginning that had held. The visits to the sanctuary had lessened, not out of lack of care, but respect. Ash and Clover had begun to range farther, often out of sight during the allotted hours for observation. The staff said it was good, a sign of independence, of rewilding instincts finally taking hold. Kaylin had felt it too, the shift from guardianship to reverence. The cubs no longer needed saving. They needed space to become what they were meant to be. And so Kaylin began to let go again, this time willingly. Still, when Emmy suggested they go one last time before the season turned, he didn't hesitate. "We'll bring apples," she said, "and the camera?" They set out just after sunrise on the final Saturday of October, the truck heavy with picnic baskets and wool blankets, Emmy wrapped in a scarf that had once belonged to her mother. The drive was familiar now, past fields brittle with frost, past hollowed-out barns leaning into the wind, past trees shedding their final brilliance. The sanctuary stood quiet under the weight of early light, and the staff met them with knowing smiles. "They're still here," Marn said, "though they come when they want now. Sometimes not at all." Kaylin understood. You can't hold on to wildness. You can only witness it when it allows. They walked to the observation ridge, Emmy balancing the camera case over one shoulder, Kaylin with a thermos in one hand and 2 apples in his coat pocket. The wind was sharp, whistling low through the pine trees, carrying the scent of damp earth and old leaves. They sat in silence for a long time, staring into the clearing where they'd last seen the cubs playing months ago. "What if they don't come?" Emmy asked softly after an hour. "Then they don't," Kaylin replied. "But we still came." She nodded, pulling her knees to her chest, chin resting on denim. Another hour passed. The sun crept higher. Somewhere, a raven called, distant and echoing, just as they stood to leave. Kaylin caught movement at the edge of the tree-line, a ripple in the golden ferns. He froze, lifting a hand. Emmy stilled beside him. From the shadows stepped Ash, larger than ever now, his coat thick and silvering in patches, his shoulders wide and steady. He paused, sensing the air, then walked forward with the same slow, deliberate grace Kaylin remembered from the early days. A few feet behind, Clover followed, smaller, lighter, but no less sure in her steps. Her gaze moved between them, cautious but curious. They didn't come all the way to the fence this time. They stood 10 yards out, just watching, as if deciding whether this farewell was one they needed too. Kaylin reached slowly into his pocket and rolled the apples toward the grass. Ash approached, sniffed, then nudged one gently with his nose before carrying it back toward the tree-line. Clover sat, then lay down, paws crossed, like she was posing for a painting. Emmy lifted the camera, took a single photo, then lowered it again. "I don't think we need more than that," she whispered. Kaylin nodded. "One is enough." They stood there for several minutes, the 4 of them in a silence so complete it almost echoed. When Ash finally turned to go, Clover followed, no backward glance this time, just the sound of leaves parting, and then the trees closing behind them. Back at the truck, Emmy placed the camera carefully on the seat. "Do you think they'll be okay?" she asked. Kaylin looked toward the woods, their colors burning bright even as the first winds of winter stirred. "They already are," he replied. They drove back in near silence, the kind that filled rather than emptied. Fernbrook greeted them with smoke rising from chimneys, kids in scarves racing across yards, the whole town holding its breath before snow. Kaylin pulled into the driveway, killed the engine, and sat there for a long moment before reaching across to take Emmy's hand. She squeezed his fingers, then smiled. "We're going to be okay too." That night, Lena joined them for dinner, Bringing a basket of rosemary bread and a bottle of red wine she insisted was saved for special occasions. They ate around the lights strung across the ceiling, casting a soft glow. Emmy told stories from school, her voice animated and full of energy, while Kaylin listened, smiling more with each word. When the meal ended, Lena poured the last of the wine and said, "You know, I've been thinking of expanding the clinic. Maybe adding a small sanctuary of our own, just a few acres. Could use some help." Kaylin looked at Emmy, who nodded eagerly. "We're in," she said, speaking for them both. Later, after the fire had died down and the dishes were done, Kaylin stepped outside into the cold night. The stars were bright, unshaken by the wind. He stood beneath them, hands in his pockets, the quiet wrapping around him like a long-lost friend. He thought of the road he'd left behind, the long years of loneliness, the weight of regret that had once filled his chest like gravel. It was still there in places, but now it was softer, reshaped by forgiveness. He had once believed he was beyond saving, but Ash and Clover had taught him otherwise. So had Emmy. He had carried two fragile lives through a storm, and in doing so, had found his own way back to the light. Behind him, the door creaked open. Emmy leaned out, wrapped in a blanket. "Come inside, Dad. It's getting cold." He turned, smiling at the word Dad, still new and healing. "Yeah," he said. "I'm coming." The door closed behind them, and the night, vast and wild and full of stars, stood watch over the little home where warmth now lived, where stories began again, and where two bear cubs once found safety and gave it in return.